Every powerful man in that penthouse made a choice the night Park Jin-woo hit the floor paralyzed and bleeding, and every single one of them chose themselves. They stepped back, recalculated, and quietly began deciding what his broken body meant for their future. Every one of them except Anna, the maid who had been there 6 hours, who owned nothing in that building, who owed him less than nothing, and who still crossed that room and refused to let him die like he did not matter. She had no idea that one decision was about to make her the most dangerous woman in Seoul. Welcome to Black in Seoul TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. She had been on the job for 6 hours when Park Jin-woo hit the floor of his own penthouse, paralyzed, bleeding, and abandoned by every single person who had ever called him loyal. His lieutenants froze. His personal doctor turned away. His own cousin, the man he had pulled from nothing and made wealthy, took one look at the blood spreading across the white marble and stepped backward toward the elevator. The moment Seoul found out Park Jin-woo was in a wheelchair, the city started dividing his empire before he was cold. His cousin moved first. His lieutenants followed. Even the men he had made rich from nothing were already at the table, making plans that did not include him. Nobody told Anna any of this. Nobody thought the maid needed to know. But Anna had been watching that penthouse for weeks, and she had already seen the shape of every lie in it. And when the moment came to choose a side, she chose the broken man in the chair that everyone else had already buried. What none of them understood was that she was about to become the reason he rose. The agency had sent Anna on a Monday. The job listing had been precise and cold, the way listings from households like this always were. Residential staff required. Discretion non-negotiable. High standards mandatory. Competitive compensation. She had been doing this work for 11 years across 3 countries, and she had learned to translate that kind of language fluently. High standards meant the employer was difficult. Discretion non-negotiable meant something inside that household could not survive daylight. Competitive compensation meant they had burned through other people and needed someone who would not run. She took the job because she needed the income. She stayed because she was not a woman who abandoned things simply because they were hard. Mrs. Yoon met her at the service entrance with the face of a woman who had spent years perfecting the expression of someone who has seen everything and reacted to nothing. She walked Anna through the penthouse with military efficiency, naming rooms, outlining duties, reciting rules. No unnecessary conversation with Mr. Park. No entry into the East Wing without authorization. No questions about visitors or phone calls or the men who came and went in dark cars. No discussing household matters outside these walls under any circumstances whatsoever. Anna listened to all of it without interrupting. She noted the rules that mattered and filed the rest. The penthouse was on the 62nd floor of a building in Hanamdong that communicated wealth so precisely it had stopped trying to impress anyone. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. The Han River below like a ribbon of dark silk. Furniture that looked like it belonged in galleries. A silence so engineered it had its own weight. She had worked in expensive homes before, but this one had a specific quality she identified immediately. It did not feel like a place where someone lived. It felt like a place where someone controlled. Every surface, every angle, every arrangement was an extension of a will so absolute it had reorganized physical space around itself. She spent 6 hours learning it. Then the night collapsed. They brought him in through the private entrance at 2:40 in the morning. She heard the commotion from the east corridor and came out to find the penthouse flooded with men she had not seen before, moving fast, speaking over each other, filling the space with the particular chaos of people who are used to being in charge discovering they are not in charge of this. 2 doctors arrived 11 minutes later. They moved through the crowd to the main reception room, where Jin-woo was on the floor. She pushed through to see. He was face down on the white marble. The suit he wore had probably cost more than her monthly salary, and it was ruined. 2 bullet wounds. His spine had taken impact from the car that rolled after the shooting. The pieces of that story assembled themselves from the fragments of panicked conversation around her. The doctors knelt. The men stood back. His personal physician was on his phone by the window. His cousin, a large man in a gray jacket whose name she would learn later was Sung Min, stood near the elevator bank with his hand pressed to his mouth, and his eyes moving around the room in a way that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with calculation. She looked at the floor beside Jin-woo where there was still space nobody was filling. She crossed the room and knelt. She did not know him. She did not owe him anything. She had been in this building for 6 hours. But he was a man on the floor in the worst moment of his life, and the space beside him was empty, and she had never been able to walk past empty spaces that should not be empty. She took his hand. He was unconscious. He did not know, but she stayed there with her hand around his until the doctors finished their initial assessment and told her she could step back. She stepped back. She did not leave the room. Nobody noticed the maid. Nobody ever did. That was the first night. The verdict came on the third day. Spinal injury. Severe. Incomplete, but the incompleteness was not particularly generous. Wheelchair. Uncertain prognosis. No guarantees of recovery, partial or otherwise. The doctor delivered this in the clipped, careful language of someone who had learned to present devastating information without the decoration of hope. Jinwoo received it in a silence so total it had its own pressure. He looked at the doctor. Said nothing. The doctor left. The men who ran his operations had established a rotation of presence in the penthouse's outer rooms. They came and went and spoke in lowered voices and wore the expressions of people in the process of updating their personal mathematics. Tae, his most senior lieutenant, a lean man with watchful eyes who had been introduced to Anna simply as Mr. Park's assistant, was the only one who went into Jinwoo's room directly. He came out each time looking like he had aged. Anna did her job. She kept the penthouse running with the precision she brought to everything. She learned his preferences from the household records and from observation. Black coffee, no sugar, specific temperature. Bedding changed every 2 days during recovery. Study organized by a system that looked random and was in fact exact. She decoded the system in 4 days. She corrected 2 inefficiencies in it without being asked. She kept the East Wing corridor clear of foot traffic during the hours the doctors came. She ensured the household ran so quietly and so well that it removed every domestic friction from a situation that had enough friction of its own. She did not see Jinwoo directly for the first 5 days. On the 6th day, she brought his morning meal, and he was awake. He was sitting up against pillows. Someone had arranged him that way because his upper body was still capable and his lower body was not, and the distinction was going to define everything about his life for the foreseeable future. He had papers on the bed tray. He was attempting to work. His face had the quality of a man who had decided his circumstances were an inconvenience he had not yet solved rather than a reality he needed to accept. She set the tray down. She turned to leave. He said, "Who are you?" She turned back. His voice was low, controlled in a way that sounded like it had taken years to build. He had very dark eyes and a face that the years had refined into something severe and almost architectural. He looked at her with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who had never in his life needed to rush his assessments. "Anna," she said. "The new house staff." "How new?" 6 days. He said nothing for a moment. "Then, you were here the night I came in." "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away first, because she was not a woman who looked away, and he was clearly not a man who had ever needed to. He said, "You stayed in the room." "Yes." "Why?" She considered the question honestly. "Because the space beside you was empty, and it should not have been." The silence after that was long. He turned back to his papers. She left. She told herself on the walk back to the kitchen that this was a professional interaction and nothing more. She told herself this with the thoroughness of a woman who knows she is telling herself something she needs to believe. The second week changed the texture of everything. His men came less. The rotation thinned from 5 or 6 daily visitors to 2, then 1, then some days none except Tae. She noticed this the way she noticed everything. Quietly. Completely. Without comment. The people who had organized their entire sense of security around proximity to Park Jinwoo were recalibrating their proximity now that the ground had shifted beneath him. They were not leaving dramatically. They were simply becoming gradually less present. The kind of disappearance that is designed to look like life rather than choice. A man's empire crumbles as he loses his legs. Those who were by his side are no longer there to his aid. But why a maid? Why did she choose to stay even when others left? Hit that subscribe button. Let's dive in. She watched it and said nothing. But she began to understand something about the specific loneliness of being a person everyone needed when you were powerful, and that same power was suddenly in question. It was not the loud loneliness of abandonment. It was the quiet kind. The kind that fills rooms that used to be full. She brought his lunch on a Wednesday and found him at the window, not in the bed. He had transferred to the chair at some point in the morning and positioned himself facing the river and was sitting with the stillness of a man who was not finding peace in the view, but could not look away from it either. She set the tray on the table. She did not immediately leave. He said, without turning, I told Mrs. Yoon I would take meals alone. She said. Mrs. Yoon relayed that. Your coffee will go cold before you turn around. He turned around then. He looked at her standing in the room with the particular expression of a man who was not accustomed to staff who used their own judgment about when instructions applied. She said, You have not eaten since yesterday morning. Your recovery requires consistent nutrition. I take my responsibilities seriously. This is not your responsibility. She looked at him steadily. You are in my care in this household. That makes it my responsibility. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly. More like recognition. The particular expression of a person encountering a quality they understand because they share it. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up the coffee. She stayed until he had eaten enough to matter. Then she took the tray and left without ceremony and without looking back, which cost her something she was not prepared to examine. The third week, he started talking to her properly. Not personally. Not with anything that could be described as openness. Instructions first, delivered in the same controlled, precise voice he used for everything. The filing in the study needed a different cross-reference system. The household accounts needed a separate column for operational expenses. The temperature in the East Corridor needed adjusting by 2 degrees. She handled all of it without comment or question, and this appeared to create in him a degree of functional trust because the instructions became observations and the observations became, somewhere around the 20th day, actual exchange. He asked her once how she had learned to move through a household without disrupting it. She told him it was not learned exactly. It was a quality that had been required of her so consistently that it had eventually become simply what she was. He was quiet after that in the way of a man turning something carefully in his hands. She learned him the way she learned every space she worked in. Thoroughly and without sentiment and with complete attention. He had a mind that moved fast and hated stillness, which made the paralysis a specific and sustained cruelty. He had been a man whose power was physical as much as strategic. The room he commanded when he entered it. The stillness he could impose on other people through presence alone. All of that had been taken without warning, and the precise shape of what that had done to his sense of himself was visible to her even when he worked very hard to make it invisible. She did not offer him false comfort. She had watched others attempt this and watched his face close every time with the efficiency of a man locking a room. What she did instead was treat him like a person who was still entirely and completely capable. She asked his opinion on the household budget restructuring and implemented his corrections exactly. She brought him information that required his attention and waited in silence while he processed it rather than filling the silence with reassurance he did not want. She organized his study so that everything he needed for a full working day was within reach from the chair. She arranged his schedule documents so the week ahead was always visible at a glance. Small architectural changes in his environment that said without words, You can still do this. All of it. From here. He noticed. She knew he noticed because the instructions stopped having the slight edge of a man testing whether she was competent and became simply the communication of a man who had decided she was. Sung-min arrived on a Thursday evening 5 weeks in. She had heard the name before. Jin-woo's cousin. Raised alongside him. Given positions and resources and protection for years on the strength of a family bond, Jin-woo had clearly honored more fully than it deserved. She served tea in the sitting room and read the texture of that conversation the way she had learned to read rooms. Sung-min was warm in the performed way. His concern for Jin-woo came out of his mouth fully formed and unconvincing. He talked about the organization, about decisions that needed making, about the reality of Jin-woo's condition and the importance of rest and the necessity of capable people managing things while he recovered. Jin-woo said, I am not recovering. I am working. Sung-min's smile was patient in the way of a man who has already made plans and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up to them. Cousin, the organization requires physical presence. That is simply the reality of what we do. She was collecting cups from the side table. She did not look up, but she felt Jin-woo's eyes find her for just a moment before he looked back at Sung-min. He said, The organization has my full direction. Nothing changes. After Sung-min left, she was finishing the sitting room when Jin-woo appeared in the doorway. He looked at her with those dark eyes and the expression that gave almost nothing away. Almost. How much did you hear? He said. Enough, she said. And she folded the cloth in her hands carefully. She said, A man who smiles that warmly while telling you to rest is not worried about your health. Park loses everything including family, yet only a stranger is there to comfort him. Do you think she is there with him because she has feelings or because she feels pity? Hit that subscribe button and answer in the comments. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, no, he is not. The following days confirmed what she had already understood. Sungmin was not waiting for Jinwoo to recover. He was waiting for Jinwoo to be distracted enough by recovery that the ground could be shifted beneath him. She saw it in the way certain lieutenants stopped coming to the penthouse and started going elsewhere. She saw it in the phone calls they took with increasing tension and decreasing information shared. She saw it in the fact that Sungmin's visits became more frequent and each one left Jinwoo slightly more contained and controlled than the last, which in her experience of him meant he was getting angrier and managing it more carefully. She brought him tea one evening when the penthouse was quiet and the city was loud below, and he was sitting at his desk with papers in front of him that he was not reading. She set the tea down and turned to leave, and he said, sit down. She sat. He said, without looking at her, do you know what it costs to build something from nothing? She said yes. He looked up then. She said, I spent 4 years building a household management business in London. Small but mine. A business partner I trusted completely dissolved the company while I was in Lagos visiting my mother. Took the contracts, the client relationships, the name. Legal. Untouchable. She met his eyes. I came to Seoul because starting over in the same city where you lost everything is its own particular kind of punishment. He was quiet. She said, I am not telling you this because I think our situations are the same. I am telling you because you asked what it costs and I know the answer. It costs more than the thing itself. It costs the version of yourself that believed the world was organized the way you thought it was. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, and what comes after that? She said, a cleaner version of yourself. If you let it. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Open at the edges. Like something held very tightly for a very long time, had shifted fractionally. He said, sit down, Anna. He gestured at the chair across from him. Not toward the door. Across from him. She sat. They talked until the city outside had gone from loud to quiet to the specific silence of 3 in the morning. Not about the organization. Not about Sungmin or the lieutenants or the empire balancing on the edge of a decision. About what it meant to build something real. What it revealed about the people around you when the foundation cracked. What you kept and what you let go and how you knew the difference. She talked. He listened with the complete attention he gave to everything that mattered, which she had come to understand was his version of saying you matter, delivered without words because words were not the primary language of a man like Jinwoo. And he talked, and she listened, and the tea went cold on the desk, and the city moved below them, and neither of them reached for a reason to end it. When she finally stood to leave, he said her name. Quietly, like something he was saying for himself. She stopped at the door. He said, thank you. She said, good night, Mr. Park. She walked down the corridor and did not examine what was happening in her chest until she was in her own room with the door closed and the quiet around her. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and was honest with herself in the way she was always honest with herself when there was no audience to manage. She was in trouble. The physiotherapy sessions began in earnest in the 6th week. Dr. Lim was a precise and experienced woman who had clearly dealt with difficult patients before and had developed a cheerful professional armor specifically for the purpose. Jinwoo was a difficult patient not dramatically or loudly, but in the particular way of a man whose entire relationship with his own body had been one of absolute command, and who was now in a situation where his body was simply not receiving the commands. Anna stayed out of the sessions. They were private and she was staff, and she understood the difference between being present and overstepping. Until Tae appeared at her door on a Tuesday morning with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally exhausted. He said, he stopped cooperating 20 minutes ago. Dr. Lim says he responds differently when you are in the room. I do not know what to do with that information, but here we are. She went in. Jinwoo was in the center of the study in his chair with his arms crossed, and the face he used when he had decided something was beneath his continued engagement. He looked at her when she entered. She looked back at him. Then she pulled a chair to the side of the room, sat down, opened the notebook she had brought, and said to Dr. Lim, please continue. He uncrossed his arms. She watched the session without comment. She did not cheer or encourage or offer the running commentary of someone who needed him to know they were supportive. She simply watched with the same quiet attention she gave to everything and occasionally wrote something in her notebook, which was in fact a grocery list, but he did not know that, and the act of being observed by someone who was not performing emotion appeared to do something useful for him. When the session ended and Dr. Lim left, he sat in the center of the room and looked at his legs with an expression she had learned to recognize as the moment the anger turned inward. She said, "For more repetitions than last week." He said, "It is not enough." She said, "It is more than last week. That is what enough means right now." He looked at her. The light came through the river windows and lay between them on the floor. He said, "Does it not exhaust you?" "What?" "Staying," he said. "Everyone is calculating their distance. You make tea and correct my filing and sit in physiotherapy sessions." He said it without self-pity. As a fact, he was examining from the outside. "Why?" She held his gaze. She said, "Because you have not given me a reason to leave. And I do not leave without a reason." He held her eyes for a long time. Then Sung-min made his move. It happened on a Friday. She was in the kitchen at 7 in the evening when Tae came in, moving fast with a controlled fury that she recognized immediately as the expression of a man delivering information he does not want to be the one delivering. He said, "Sung-min called a full organization meeting tonight. Every lieutenant. Without authorization. He is positioning himself as acting head. He has 3 of the senior lieutenants already committed. He is filing documentation claiming Jin-woo's condition constitutes incapacity." She set down what was in her hands. "Does he know?" she said. "Not yet." Tae's jaw was tight. "I am going to tell him now." She said, "I am coming with you." Tae looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. Jin-woo received the information with a stillness so absolute, it was almost a physical thing in the room. He sat behind his desk and listened to every word, and his face showed nothing. When Tae finished, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the city 60 floors below. Then Jin-woo said, "Call a full meeting. Every lieutenant. Every senior member. Tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. Tae said, "Jin-woo, Sung-min has been building this for weeks. The numbers may not be." "Tomorrow morning," Jin-woo said. His voice was the voice she imagined had built an empire. Quiet and absolute and completely uninterested in the possibility of any other outcome. Tae left to make the calls. The study was quiet. She was still in the room. He looked at her. He said, "You think I cannot do it?" She said, "I think you are about to walk into that room and remind every person in it exactly who they are and exactly who made them that." "I will not be walking," he said. The edge in his voice was not self-pity. It was fury turned inward. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of his chair. She looked down at him, and he looked up at her, and she said, "The chair is not what they follow, and you know that. They follow the mind that built what they have. They follow the name that protects what they own. They follow the man who has never once in 7 years made a decision that cost them more than it earned." She held his gaze. "You know every person who will be in that room tomorrow. You know what they want and what they fear and what they have to lose. Use it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened. Resolved. Like a decision being made and locked into place. He said, "If this works." She said, "When?" The corner of his mouth moved. The almost smile she had cataloged and filed and taken out to examine more times than was strictly professional. He said, "When this works, I am going to need you to redesign the entire filing system." She said, "I already did. 2 weeks ago." He laughed, short and genuine and surprised out of him. She had not heard him laugh before. It did something to his face that undid all the severity and showed her something younger underneath. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she said good night and walked out before either of them could do anything about the distance between them that had been disappearing for weeks. She did not sleep. She moved through the penthouse in the early hours doing things that did not need doing. She reorganized a pantry that was already organized. She polished mirrors that were already clean. She stood at the kitchen window at 4 in the morning with a cold cup of tea and watched the river and thought about a man in a chair who was going into a room full of wolves tomorrow with nothing but his mind and his name and the absolute refusal to be anything other than himself. She thought about the moment he had looked up at her and said when instead of if and the quality of certainty in it. She thought about a lot of things she did not have clean words for yet. Tae called at 11:43 the next morning. The meeting had started at 9. 2.5 hours. She had been counting. 3 words. "It is done." She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands and breathed for a long time. Jin-woo came back at noon. 2 lieutenants she recognized accompanied him to the elevator and left. The penthouse was quiet. She heard his chair in the corridor and walked out to meet him. He looked tired in the deep specific way of a man who has fought something real and won at a cost. But he also looked like himself. Fully, completely, unmistakably himself. The authority that had nothing to do with whether he was standing. He saw her in the corridor. He stopped. She said, "Take halt." He said, "Sung Min is out of the organization. Out of the city by tonight." She said, "Good." He moved down the corridor toward her and stopped close. Closer than was professional. She did not step back. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been studying for 2 months, and that still showed her new things. He said, "I told you once that everyone around me calculates their exit." She said, "I remember." He said, "You are the only person in 2 months who has moved in the opposite direction every single time." His voice was quiet, and even and completely direct. "I need you to know that I see that. I need you to know that it is not something I take lightly or intend to take for granted." She looked at him. The corridor was quiet. The city was below them. She said, "It is not something I offered lightly." He reached out and took her hand. Just that. His thumb moved across her knuckles slowly. She felt it everywhere. She said, "This is complicated." He said, "I know." She said, "I am your employee." He said, "Not for much longer if you are willing." She looked at him for a long time. This man who had been the most feared person in Seoul, and who looked at her now like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. This man who had been broken down to the foundation and had been building himself back differently. Better, with the patient and brutal honesty of someone who had been forced to see clearly. She turned her hand over in his and held it. She said, "I am willing." The months that followed were theirs in every sense. His recovery was non-linear and demanding, and there were weeks that were harder than others and weeks when sensation returned in fragments that felt like grace. She was there for all of it, not performing support, simply present in the way that costs something real and that she had decided long ago the right people were worth paying for. He was possessive in the way she had expected and managed with the same precision he brought to everything. A man at a business dinner held her hand too long during an introduction, and Jin-woo was at her shoulder within 30 seconds with his hand at the small of her back and a smile that communicated exactly nothing warm to the man in front of him. The man found a reason to be elsewhere almost immediately. She said to Jin-woo in the car afterward, "You cannot place yourself between me and every man who looks at me incorrectly." He said, "I am not doing it for every man. Just the ones who need to understand something." She shook her head. He watched her from the other side of the car with a particular expression that meant he was completely unrepentant and fully aware of it. She looked out the window and fought a smile the whole way home. He proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening in the study. No performance, no grand arrangement. Just the two of them in the room where they had first talked honestly, city lights low through the windows, her reading across from him watching her with the attention he had stopped pretending was about anything other than what it was. He said her name. She looked up. He said, "Marry me." She closed the book slowly. She looked at him. The man who had come home broken on the night she arrived. The man who had been abandoned by everyone who owed him loyalty and had rebuilt himself in the presence of a woman who owed him nothing and stayed anyway. She said, "You are not even going to attempt one knee." He said, "When I can do it properly, I will do it again. And mean it just as much." She stood up. She crossed the room. She stood in front of his chair and took his face in both hands, and he reached up and covered her hands with his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the quiet study with everything that had brought them here, sitting between them like something earned. She said yes. 6 months later, in a small garden outside the city with 20 people and no media, and the Han River visible beyond the walls, Anna wore white and walked down an aisle lined with people who had watched this story from close enough to know what it had cost. Jin-woo was at the front. He was standing. She stopped walking when she saw it. Her hand went over her mouth. He had been practicing for 8 weeks. In secret, Dr. Lim and Tae sworn to silence. She had not known. He stood at the front of that garden with a walker and the expression of a man who had decided this moment was worth every impossible and brutal and humbling thing he had fought through to reach it. She walked to him. She took his hands. His were steady. Hers were not. The officiant said the words that had been said at every wedding since people decided love deserved ceremony, and Jin-woo looked at her through all of it with the full and complete attention he had given her from the very first morning she had refused to leave his room until he ate. He said "I do" in a voice that carried. She said it back in a voice that broke slightly and recovered. They kissed in the morning light while the people who loved them made noise, and the river ran on below, and the city that had once tried to bury Park Jin-woo moved through its ordinary Friday entirely unaware that the most feared man in Seoul was standing in a garden in the sunshine, holding the hands of the woman who had refused to let him be alone on the floor. A year after the wedding, Anna stood in the kitchen of their home, smaller than the penthouse and more real in every way that mattered, and looked at the test in her hand for a long time. Jinwoo came in. He read her face before he read anything else, which was something he had always been able to do and which still caught her off guard sometimes. He said, "What is it?" She crossed the room and put the test in his hand. He looked at it. The silence was long. She watched everything move through his face, the shock first, and then something vast and quiet rising beneath it. Something that had no name in the language of the man he had been before all of this, but that the man he was now received completely. He looked up at her. She said yes. He pulled her in with the arm that was not holding the test, and she went into him and put her face against his neck, and they stood in the kitchen of their chosen life, while Seoul moved outside indifferent and loud and entirely unaware of what was happening inside this silence. She had been on the job for 6 hours when everything changed. She had not known it then. She was a woman who had shown up for work and found a man on the floor and had done what she always did when she found empty spaces that should not be empty. She had filled them. She had not known that the space beside him would become the most important place she ever stood. She had not known that staying, the simple radical act of not leaving, would become the thing that changed them both. He had been the most feared man in Seoul. She had been the woman who stayed. And in the space between those two things, in the long, quiet hours of recovery and honesty and late nights and small, fierce acts of loyalty, they had built something neither of them had ever had before. Something real. Something chosen. Something that had survived every person who tried to take it apart and come out the other side stronger for having been tested. She had been on the job for 6 hours. She stayed for the rest of her life. And it turned out that was exactly enough. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe to Black and Soul TV, and stay tuned.